Okay, good morning. Thanks for organizing this wonderful school and inviting me to talk about numerical techniques for galaxy formation. So there are many experts here. So I have the privilege to be in charge of teaching you what are the techniques here. So I will divide up my lectures in those bullet points. So I will start with a very brief introduction on the context, which is cosmological simulation of galaxy formation. So we heard a lot about already about idealized simulations or isolated simulations. Everything I'm going to say applies to those kind of simulations too, but I just want to start with the specific context of the cosmological environment. And then I will basically go through the main components of our simulations, starting with n-body techniques. I will have a brief discussion on high-performance computing. What does it mean? What are the technological evolutions? What kind of computer are we using those days? And possibly in the future. And then I will discuss hydrodynamics. I will focus on one very important aspect, which is trying to control the numerical errors, or what is called numerical diffusion. Then I will discuss MHD and radiative transfer, which are both components of our galaxy formation simulations, which have been introduced recently with a lot of promising results coming out of those. And then finally, I will discuss subgrid physics in the context of those simulations and modeling techniques. So let me start with the principles. So basically, the game we are playing in cosmological simulations is outlined here. And we are actually very fortunate to know our initial condition. And there is not a lot of disciplines where you can start with a well-defined initial condition. So that's basically the CMB, the Gaussian random fluctuations we start from, and we see in the sky. And then the goal here is to put these fluctuations with the proper composition for the universe, and then just forward model in a periodic box and obtain a prediction that we can compare to the distribution and the properties of galaxies today. And so it's a very well-posed problem at first sight, at least, in the sense that the initial conditions are well defined, and the physics is also relatively under control, as far as, of course, we ignore the very small scale, which is encapsulated in this subgrid model terminology. So on a technical side, in order to start your simulation, you need to generate your initial conditions. And so that's basically a cookbook on where and how you can do that. So there is a big collection of codes out there. Some are public, like those one I've listed. Some are not, but usually the authors are happy to share. And the bottom line is that they will generate the Gaussian random field, assuming you have an initial power spectrum, for example, similar to this reference here, whether it's analytical or whether it's come out of a so-called Boltzmann code that will generate the power spectrum or the transfer function of your Gaussian random field. Once you know this, basically once you know your cosmology, then you can use any of those codes to generate your Gaussian random field. Of course, you have to input some simulation parameters here at this level, which is basically the box size, the initial grid resolution, and the random seed you're going to use to generate your Gaussian field. And then the output of these codes, it's basically a bunch of files, which in case of those codes, actually the earlier version of those graphic family is listed here. And so what you have is the velocity field of the cold dark matter fluid. You have the density perturbation of the gas, and then the velocity field of gas. And based on this, you know all your information. You can ask your favorite code to read in these files, and the simulation can start immediately. So there is another technique which is now very popular in the field of galaxy formation, which is the so-called zoom-in technique, where instead of performing a gigantic periodic box simulation, you want to focus on one specific region of interest, which is basically the halo, for example, of a Milky Way-like galaxy. And so the recipe is explained here. So you have first to detect in a periodic box cosmological simulation one halo you like. Then you identify all the particles that are in this halo. And then you map back in the initial condition the position of those particles. And this defines a Lagrangian volume in the initial condition. And then you will generate higher resolution modes of your Gaussian random field in this volume. And you can then, from this increased resolution set of initial conditions, you can then, forward in time, re-simulate your volume of interest. Of course, there is one critical point here that most of you have experienced already, if you are playing with the Zoom simulation, is that you have to check for contamination. So if your initial halo here is contaminated by particles which comes from low-resolution region. And so your initial condition usually most of the time looks like that. So it's a set of nested box with increasing resolution as you zoom onto the region of interest. So this technique is very popular, and there are many codes that can help you to do this kind of painful but very efficient approach. Okay, so another specific thing for cosmological simulation is the fact that you are supposed to model a fluid in an expanding universe. And so here there are many different approaches. There is one approach I like particularly, is the so-called supercomoving coordinates, which are described in this paper here. And so basically the idea is that you have to put yourself in a co-moving coordinate system, which is basically moving with the expansion, so that your coordinate is not the traditional spatial coordinate, but it's scaled by the scale factor of the universe. And so in this coordinate system, your particles are not moving because of the expansion. They're only moving because of the peculiar motions. And so you have to define scaled variables, scaled density with a tilde, scaled peculiar velocities, and so on and so forth, which are actually independent on the effect of the expansion. So there is one trick which is specific to this approach described in this paper here, is to define a new time coordinate, this supercomoving time, d tau, defined like that, where dt is the usual time and a is divided by a square. And if you do this, then there is a magical thing that happens. All the fluid equations which are written in an expanding universe simplifies into equations without the expansion. So the expansion has been completely removed out of the problem. And then your code, written like that, can be used either for cosmological simulation or for normal isolated box simulation without any modification to the equation, except for one thing, which is the Poisson's equation, where now the coefficient here is not 4 pi g anymore, but it's this scale factor times omega matter. So provided, of course, that you have a dust called dark matter or an adiabatic gas with gamma equal 5/3, this transformation allows you to have in your code equations which are completely independent of the coordinate system. Okay, so once you're there, that's it. You're going to solve the equations that I'm going to describe in a minute. And of course, you have to choose your different fluids. So that's the tricky part of galaxy formation, is that it's a complicated system. You have basically 11 bullet points here. Each of one describes a typical fluid, which has to be modeled dynamically using a specific technique. So of course, dark matter is the main component, and dark matter follows the Vlasov equation, Vlasov-Poisson equation. Gas, it's a collisional fluid. It follows the Euler-Poisson equation. Then, of course, you have radiation. Radiation is usually modeled as an optically thin fluid, so to speak. But at higher density, you have to do the proper radiative transfer, so it's another challenge. Of course, magnetic fields. Then you have stars, which is also a collisionless fluid, so follows the Vlasov equation. You have also supermassive black holes, which has to be described as individual accreting particle. And then you can also add cosmic rays, which is another type of fluid with very different properties than all the ones I've described before. You have, of course, the chemical composition of your fluid, which add more complexity to the problem. And then you can also more exotic, but very, very timely fluids, for example, massive neutrinos. So this is basically the list of components you have to include in your cosmological simulation if you want to have a predictive and accurate model. So of course, this list looks a bit scary at first, but we'll go through the techniques, and then maybe it will make more sense. Okay, so let's first start with the basic ingredient of all these codes, which is the backbone of all these different fluids I just described, which is the dynamics of dark matter, which is the dominant mass component in the universe. And so, as I said, dark matter is following the collisionless Boltzmann equation, or the Vlasov equation. So it's basically the conservation of the particle number in phase space. And on the right-hand side, you have a 0. So there is no collision term. The acceleration here, A, is given by the gradient of the gravitational potential, which is the solution of the Poisson's equation, where the particle number density, n, is just given by integrating in velocity space the distribution function. So that's basically the closed system you want to solve. Everything is defined here. So if you start with a set of initial conditions, which is usually a very cold sheet in phase space, then it's just a computational problem. And so it's a complicated one, though. So there is several strategies. I would say when you look at that, the most basic strategy is actually to discretize your phase space. So you discretize the 6-dimensional grid in phase space, and then you just solve this equation in 6D. Because this equation is so simple, it's basically an advection. It's basically the conservation of the number of particles in phase space, given the Poisson's equation that you have on the side. There is actually, so of course it's doable only recently. The first interesting results have been obtained in, quite recently, like 5 years ago, because of the computing power, which is now enough to do this like that. There is another approach which uses the specific aspects of dark matter being very cold, so that there is, in phase space, the dark matter distribution, at least initially, is a very thin, actually singular sheet, which fold on each other as time goes by. And so you can actually describe this only as a 3D manifold inside a 6-dimensional space. And this makes the whole problem computationally more tractable, and that's a nice technique that was introduced here, and it's been developed ever since. That's one approach, right? The brute force phase space approach. The other approach, which is the most popular one, is to use Lagrangian discretization of space using particles, macro particles, and then to evolve those particles as following the individual trajectories. So that's, of course, the most popular technique, the so-called n-body technique, and I will describe how it works. There is different version of that. One where you solve the Poisson equation using directly the interaction between those particles. And there is a second version of that where you use a mesh. So you discretize the spatial domain using a mesh, which is called the particle mesh technique. Okay. So here is basically now a very brief history of n-body codes. So n-body codes are just integrating trajectories of those macro particles. So it's a very simple problem. You just have to solve the acceleration. You displace the particle following their velocity, and you update the velocity following the acceleration. Right? And of course, you just need to compute phi, the gravitational potential, by solving the Poisson's equation. So the trajectory part is easy. I mean, you have to use a proper time integrator, of course, and I'm not going to discuss this. But so here the key point is how do you compute phi, the gravitational potential. And here's basically a list of techniques, which is actually a chronological order that were developed to solve this problem. So the most obvious one is to compute the direct interaction between all those particles, the 1/r² interaction between all those particles. It's a very accurate technique. It's very time-consuming because it scales as the number of particles square. Then later, the first efficient method, which scales as n log n, was introduced by using this particle mesh approach. So you have to define a mesh, and then you project the mass of the particle onto the mesh, solve the Poisson's equation of the mesh, and you're done. There is a hybrid of the two, which was developed a bit later, which is PQBEM. So it's PP on small scales and PM on large scales. The problem is that the scaling on small scale is not very good, so you can't really go to very high resolution. Then the very first high resolution code that was introduced is the so-called tree code. I'm going to describe it, which is also n log n, but allow a very high resolution. Finally, a bit later, adaptive particle mesh, adaptive PM were introduced. And now I think one of the latest very promising method is the fast multiple method, because it's an order n method. So now, you know, historically, we moved from n square in terms of costs to n log n. And finally, now we are dealing with order n method. So it's kind of spectacular. OK, direct n-body solver. So brute force approach, historically the first thing to be introduced, but it's still very useful today to model collisional system like star cluster, globular cluster. And the best code in the market, I think it's n-body 6, which has been developed by a very large community for years. What is interesting is that the most recent versions, they run on graphical processing unit, which are very efficient to compute these brute force direct n-square calculations. And the typical figure you have to remember is that now it's possible to model the evolution of a globular cluster system with 1 million particles over a very large amount of time on those modern GPU clusters. So the time integration is very important here, because you need to be very accurate in order to integrate those trajectories. So these are very elaborate high-order time integrators. So n-body 6 use the fourth order Hermite integrator. You have to check in what it means exactly. And then, this, as I said, right, this is used for very collisional systems. So you need systems for which you need to be very accurate, or you need to integrate for a very long time. Systems where you have tight binaries, like a stellar system with tight binaries. If you want to be able to evolve the large-scale dynamical evolution of the stellar system and in the same time evolve the binary evolution of the binaries you have in this system, you need to use this technique. And also when you have a supermassive black hole with very tight stellar orbits around the supermassive black hole. So that's the typical application you can use for these codes. Interestingly, a recent paper by Walter Denen showed that you can use actually tree codes or fast multiple methods and still be accurate enough for this kind of technique, right? So for this kind of problems. So that's an interesting recent development, I think. So maybe it's not necessarily for globular cluster physics or star cluster physics to use this direct n-square calculation. Maybe we can do better. OK, so that's the direct n-body solver approach, the n-square approach. Now, let me describe quickly the particle mesh. So here, the idea is to use a mesh. So you have to discretize your box in small mesh elements, small cells. The first thing is to compute the density field on the mesh by depositing the mass of your particle onto the mesh. So this is the so-called mass deposition step. Then once the mass is distributed on the mesh, then you just solve the Poisson equation by discretizing the Poisson equation on the mesh. You have the gravitational potential. Then you differentiate the gravitational potential to get the gravitational force. And then you interpolate this force back onto the particle position. And then you have the force on the particle, and you're back to square one, right? So the Bible of this technique is here, Hockney-Eastwood. And the critical component here is the mass deposition scheme. How do you deposit the mass on the mesh? And there is basically a whole hierarchy of schemes which are listed here, and there is an infinite hierarchy actually. The more you go down this list, the more you will smooth the mass of the particle over more and more mesh elements, but the more isotropic and the more accurate your force will become, right? And of course, the more expensive it will become. So here, for example, solution one, nearest grid point, what does it mean? It means that if you have a particle here as the white circle, you will deposit all the mass of the particle in this cell, right? So you basically assign the mass to the nearest grid point. So you assign all the mass here and nothing in those neighboring cells. Of course, there is a problem, is that if the particle moves continuously and cross this boundary, the mass will jump from this cell to this one. Not very good. Now there is a second technique, the so-called cloud in cell, where now you assume that your particle has a little cloud, of square shape, and then you assign the mass to the 4 cells in proportion to the area of intersection between the cloud and the cells. Now it's better because you see that when the particle moves, the mass deposition moves continuously, right? And then you can go higher and higher, so you have a so-called triangular shape, where the mass distribution, now you have a larger cloud, so you have to consider a larger cloud, and now the mass is not uniformly distributed inside, but there is a linear shape, and then you have a quadratic shape, and then a cubic shape, and so on and so forth, right? So that's how you generate this hierarchy of shapes. And then you can write formally the density field on the grid as the sum of the particle multiplied by the integral of the shape, whatever it is, on the volume of the particle, right? So that's the general kind of mass deposition strategy. Okay, so is it accurate, this PM particle mesh force? Well, not really. So here what I've shown is the force, the numerical force divided by the true force. So for a direct n-body code, it would be 1 everywhere, right? Because it's directly 1 over r squared. Here you see that it's 1 or it's close to 1, and then it drops as you cross 1 cell. So the force is smooth, is killed within a resolution element of 1 cell. So the resolution is governed by the cell size, right? So if you want better resolution, you have to use smaller cells, right? Now that's the tangential force, which should be 0. The tangential force should be 0. You see that you have a small tangential force, and it's not so small here. It's actually 20%, right, at the 1 cell separation. So that's possibly a problem, but here I show you an example of particle trajectories where the separation of the particle to the center of mass here is actually 1 cell. So you see you are at the peak of the error, and you see that the trajectory remains reasonably circular, right? So it means that that's an error, but the error tends to cancel out over the orbits of your particle, right? Because it's uncorrelated error. Okay, so one obvious addition here is to, if you realize that the force resolution is governed by the cell size, then you have to make your grids bigger and bigger, and the cell size smaller and smaller. But actually, this comes with a huge cost, because if you have a gigantic grid, then your n log n Poisson solver will, even if it's n log n, right, n becomes very, very large, actually much larger than the particle n, and then the method becomes a bit stupid, right? So one way to improve here is to use an adaptive mesh, where actually you refine the mesh only where you have particles. And so by doing this, you improve the force resolution automatically in regions where the particle density is high. And so when you have a lot of particles here, clumps here, then your mesh refines automatically. And then you can increase the force resolution using this mesh approach so that the force resolution adapts to the particle density. And so there are a lot of codes used in the galaxy formation community, which are based on this adaptive particle mesh technique. I listed 3 here, the most popular, ART, 4, ART, ENSO, Ramses, and Flash. What is interesting is that they're all based on the same idea, so n-body particles, an adaptive mesh, but they all use very different Poisson solver. And actually, that's an interesting distinction between those codes. So what kind of Poisson solver now do we use? So there's 2 types. I divided them in 2 types. The first is what I would call the relaxation solver. I will define more what it means. And the second type is the convolution solvers. So relaxation solver means that you will solve the Poisson equation, which is actually like a matrix to invert, right? So it's a linear operator. the Laplace operator is a linear operator that you apply to phi, the unknown, and you want to solve Laplace of phi equal rho, right? So you have to invert the operator Laplacian. So you can do this, like any matrix inversion schemes, by relaxing your first guess towards the solution. And so relaxation solver, usually how it works is you try to find the solution of Poisson's equation on a given level, on a given adaptive level, by fixing the boundary condition at the boundary of your level, right? It's called Dirichlet boundary condition because you fix the value of the potential at the boundary, and then you iterate until your potential converges to the solution. So that's called this iteration is called the relaxation method because you relax to the solution, starting with the first guess, which is usually 0 most of the time. In the adaptive particle mesh framework, the boundary condition, where does it come from? Well, it comes from the previous step where you have solved Poisson's equation at the coarser level. And so you have this hierarchical approach. You solve the Poisson equation on the coarsest level, where you have periodic boundary conditions, so easy. And then you interpolate your potential at the boundary of the final level, solve it again, and so on and so forth, right? So now what kind of relaxation method can you use? Well, there is basically 3 options that have been developed in the literature. The simplest one, which is the so-called Gauss-Seidel approach. I will show in a minute how it means. Then there is the conjugate gradient technique, which is a very popular technique to invert symmetric matrices. And then the most powerful, I think, is the multigrid method. So that's basically the relaxation solver. The convolution methods, or the convolution solvers, is a second type of method. Here, the idea is that you solve Poisson's equation by convolving the mass distribution that you have on your mesh by the green function, which is basically the solution of Poisson's equation with a point mass. And so it's really a convolution method in the sense that you just convolve your mass distribution, right? And so how do you do this convolution? There is basically 2 options here. You can either use fast Fourier transform to do the convolution in Fourier space, because as you know, convolution in Fourier space is just a multiplication, so it's very easy. Except that for adaptive meshes, you have to do an hierarchical Fourier transform, so it's slightly more involving, with, of course, particular care to the boundary condition in this hierarchical grid. And then the second approach is the so-called tree method, or fast multiple method, where you do the convolution directly, in direct space, but you do it cleverly, using a tree, right? So there is a big distinction between the two, which, in case of Poisson's equation, is not really a problem, right? But the fact that you assume that you can solve the problem using a convolution restrict yourself to the Poisson equation, right? I'm saying this because now there are a lot of popular modified gravity models, like MOND or F over gravity or whatever, where the gravity is not necessarily given by Poisson's equation, right? You can have, for example, nonlinear Poisson's equation, where the coefficients of your Poisson's equation are a function of the potential you're trying to solve. Like MOND, for example, modified Newtonian gravity, is such an example where the potential depends on the strength of the potential, right? So you have a nonlinear effect, meaning that if it's nonlinear, you cannot use the Green's function approach, right? And if it's nonlinear, on the other hand, you can use those relaxation methods, right? So in the context of those modified gravity models, there is a competitive advantage of method of type 1, is that you can solve nonlinear gravity problems, which is interesting. Okay, now let me spend some time describing the multigrid method. So the multigrid method is basically a relaxation method, but which uses an acceleration mechanism, which is very simple, which is to degrade temporarily the resolution of your solution to make sure that the large-scale modes will converge quickly or faster towards the solution. So how does it work? First, you have your typical relaxation method. So that's the Gauss-Seidel method. So that's how you solve Poisson's equation naively. So you start with a first solution at step n. So that's your, it's a 2D version here of Poisson's equation. So that's your Laplacian kernel, and that's your right-hand side. And here, if you have this recurrence or this series where phi n plus 1 is defined like that, then if you iterate infinite amount of time, you will converge to the correct solution. You will converge to Laplace of phi infinity equal rho. Right? So it's a very slow process. I mean, you can try on your computer, it's very slow, right? In order to converge to a reasonable level of errors, it takes hundreds and hundreds of iterations. And more importantly, the number of iterations you need, it depends crucially on the size of the grid. So for bigger simulation, it's slower because your simulation is bigger, but also the number of iterations you need is going to be larger. So it's really bad, right? But it's so simple, right? So the idea of the multigrid method is to actually define the residual of your iteration problem and to restrict the residual to a coarser level, to a grid of level L-1 with a larger cell, right? Larger cell size. Then you solve a new Poisson's equation problem at the coarse level, which is much cheaper because the grid is smaller. The resolution is worse, so it's cheaper to do. So you can solve on the coarse problem much faster. And then, so in this example, you reach infinity, so you solve completely the problem. And then you prolong the solution you found to the finer grid. And then you add this correction to your finer grid solution. And that's define your new iteration. And the fact that you spend some time at the coarse level will actually take care of the long-range modes in your solution, while the small, fast-moving wavelength will be taken care of by the relaxation method at the fine grid level. And so that's basically the idea of this multigrid method. So this is the so-called two-step algorithm here, two-level algorithm. So one fine level, one coarse level. But of course, what is done usually is to do this recursively. So what you do is you apply this scheme recursively. So you start with the finest level, you iterate, you restrict the residual, you iterate, you restrict again the residual one more level, and so on and so forth, all the way up to a very, very coarse level, which is basically one cell covering your entire domain. And then you prolong the error down until the finest level. And this so-called V-cycle here will almost have you converge completely to the solution. And so it's a very fast technique, right? So here is the main properties of the multigrid technique. It converges in a very few iterations, where one iteration is a complete cycle, of course. Right? So one iteration is costly, but in a few iterations it converges. So that's an example of the residual going down as a number of iterations, right? And so basically you reach Massey precision accuracy in 10 iterations. So it's spectacular, right? So it's also an order n algorithm. So, of course, there is one big catch here, is that when you are using this in an adaptive mesh framework, in AMR framework, the problem you have to solve at a given level has a very complex boundary condition, right? So the boundary condition is an issue. So you see here that's, for example, an example where you have a fine level, you want to solve the Poisson's equation on this, and the boundary condition is interpolated from the coarser level, right? And you see the boundary condition is the red lines here. And now you do your multigrid cycles, right? You do a multigrid cycle, so you define a restriction of the residual to coarser and coarser level. And you see that something dramatic happens here, is that from this to this, you have lost completely the boundary condition. And if you do this, it will kill your convergence. So you have to be very careful. So there is so it's described here in this paper and many others, how to handle this properly, because it can break your method if you're not careful with this problem, specific to adaptive mesh techniques when you implement the multigrid. Okay, is it accurate? So that's the particle mesh method. And that's the adaptive particle mesh method, where you have added 6 more levels. So now your force accuracy is the same as before, 20%, but at, of course, one cell of the finest grid you have introduced, right? So you have really pushed your resolution to the left quite significantly, right? So that's the good, positive result of that. the negative result is that you have this error here at the percent level, which is maintained here up to very large scales, right? And so basically, adaptive mesh refinement will never give you something as good as a fully refined grid. And that's something to have in mind, right? And you can see it clearly, right? Had you a fully refined grid at the maximum level here, so a 8,000 cube grid, then the error would have gone like that, and then like very, very accurate estimation at large distances. But here, because your grid resolution is actually worse and worse as you move outside, you maintain the error at a level which is at a percent, which you have to realize. Okay, now the other popular codes in the market are the so-called tree code or fast multiple methods. So here it was introduced by Barnes and Hutt in the late 80s. And so the idea is that when you have a particle distribution like that, you will decompose space into an octree where each cell contains a predefined number of particles. And so you have a log n distribution here of your particle. And then the magic here is to realize that when you want to compute the force of this particle, for example, you don't need to loop on all those particles. What you can do is to replace this chunk of particle by the center of mass of this ensemble of particles, and then compute the force only between this guy and the center of mass of this guy. And so what you do is for each cell, you compute the center of mass, which is the first order multiple, but you can compute higher order multiples inside all those cells. And then, depending on an opening criteria, so depending on how far your particles are to the particle of interest, you can group them or not into multiples. And so that's a very clever trick which allows you to have a scaling of n log n without relying on a grid, right? Because here there is no, there is a grid, but it's an octree that can be arbitrarily high resolution. Once you are inside the cell, the interaction of the particle are dealt with using direct n-square gravity. So that's the tree code. Now the fast multiple method goes one step further. So it was introduced in astronomy by Walter Dennen, but it's been developed actually 1 decade before. The idea is that to push this idea, but one step further by realizing that you can also do the same trick to interpolate the force on the particle. So for example, instead of looping over all the particles one by one and computing the force by going down the tree, you can also define a second tree to interpolate the force back onto the particle. And by doing this, you can approximate the force using a multiple description, not only the mass description, but also the force itself. And then, depending on a second opening criteria, you can decide to interpolate a very coarse force onto the particle because they don't need to be so accurate. And so by doing this, so this double tree, you can have actually an algorithm that scales n, order n. And it's also exactly momentum conserving. So I think this fast multiple method is a bit complicated. It's very challenging to parallelize, but it's really a beautiful method in this context. Okay, so now we've been through all the method for n-body. So now, how accurate are those methods? Right? It's a big question. And so here, that's something we did a couple of years ago, where we tried to compare using a metric, using an observable, which is the power spectrum of the density fluctuations. So it's basically the power as a function of scales. And we have run exactly the same simulation, starting with exactly the same cosmological initial condition, using 3 different codes. And at redshift 0, at the end, we have compared the power spectrum, right, by computing the ratio of the power spectrum. And we use the reference power spectrum, which is Ramsès in this case. And you see that all those codes, they agree to better than 1%, significantly better than 1%, which is the gray area. But then at small scales, they disagree, right? And here, here we're talking about 3% accuracy, so it's very accurate, right? But still, we are not better than 1% at small scales, right, at large scale. And in the context of the large-scale galaxy surveys, this is a very important point because that's the theoretical uncertainty we have in the n-body techniques, right? It's a very small uncertainty. I think it's very accurate, but maybe not enough, right? That's the question, right? So, yep.
This comparison is at fixed what? Is this sort of for comparable computation time, or?
So same particle number. No. The
different methods, of course.
Exactly. Exactly. Very a factor of 10 actually. No. So basically, the time was not an issue here. Okay. We assume infinite, you know. No, but it's true. You're right because Picardie Graph, for example, is a code that works on GPU, which is very fast, and you could have run something much bigger for the same computational time. No, here it's really to test the numerical techniques only.
You also said that you use Ramses as the reference solution.
Yeah, it could have been. Yeah, it could have been another code. Yeah.
So did you run that at like higher resolution or something?
No.
To make sure that it was the. Or are you just saying, oh, well, the difference between these codes is at the 3%?
We don't know which one is right.
Yeah.
Right. We have no idea. So we pick one. So since I'm the one presenting, I pick my code. But but it could have been any other one, and then it would not have changed the visual appearance here.
Yes.
Okay, now a brief word on high-performance computing. That's basically a key factor here, which is driven by technology. And large supercomputers are a key tool here, and most of you are using them. The key point here is that the real driver is not us, it's not science. The real driver is actually those days is gaming. The gaming industry, one successful game generates enough money to subsidize all the supercomputers in the world, basically. So that's the budget of HPC, the high-performance computing. The annual budget is around, I would say, $400 million per year. If you count everybody, all the supercomputers in the world, what they spend per year. And that's what Fortnite probably made last year. Right? So it's completely out of scale, right? So we completely depend on other. So we have no say, right? So we're like, oh my God, I want to build a supercomputer. What do you have? What can you sell me? Oh, I have this for gaming. Is this something you can use? Okay, fine. I have no other choice. No, okay, so I use it. So that's basically how it works, right? So we are basically completely dependent on the technology, which is not in our hand here. We can try to optimize this as much as we can, but it's not really our say. So the key factor here is that the computing power is doubling every year, at least up till now, right? And so you can actually draw a line here, which on the x-axis is the year, and on the y-axis is the computing power in terms of floating point operation, right? So how many floating point operation can you do? And so this is a 1,000 kilo scale, so 1,000 floating point operation per second. This is mega, so 1 million operation per second, and so on and so forth, right? 1 billion, 10 to the 12, 10 to the 15, right? And so now we are at actually beyond 10 to the 15, and we are approaching the exascale, which is 10 to the 18. 10 to the 18 floating point operation per second, right? So it's so now, technologically, the first computers that have been developed in the 60s is the so-called von Neumann, the von Neumann architecture, the von Neumann idea, which is quite a structuring idea where you put the computing power, the computing element, the CPU, here, above, and then the memory is there, below, right? And then there is a data flow between the memory and the CPU, which, so it's a quite strict kind of philosophy in terms of design, right? So it's so-called von Neumann architecture. And we've been using this until now, right? So now, so up to the, I would say, late 90s, it was the same idea, except that the access to the memory was parallelized. So you had, instead of one link, you had many links, right? And this many link was called the vector processing. called vector processing, because you had one memory, one CPU, but a parallelized access to memory, very fast. Right? So, but until to the late 90s, that's the idea, right? One CPU, one memory, very fast memory access. Now later, different architecture came up, still von Neumann, right? But the processing elements were now parallelized. So you had more cores, and each of those cores had access to the memory. And this is the so-called multi-core, or multiple CPU, sharing the same memory bench, right? But then we decided here, after the 90s, that in order to boost the computing power, we had to parallelize, right? So we used a lot of those nodes in parallel, right? Of course, those nodes are linked outside the node here by InfiniBand cables, fiber cables, which transport information, but now the memory is distant, completely different programming paradigm. And now we are moving to a new architecture, where now you have hybrid nodes, where you have a classical multi-core chip with the main memory, and you have an accelerator, which is in this case a GPU, a graphical processing unit, for gaming, with its own memory, right? And so that's where we are now in this era here. Okay, so now in terms of programming, it has a lot of consequences. So you need to use languages or libraries that allow you to program in parallel. So MPI, Message Passing Interface, which is the dominant programming technique here. You can have also a hybrid approach where you use OpenMP inside the node and MPI in between nodes. But the big change recently was the use of GPUs. Right? And now you have more, I would say, recent development, which are interesting. For example, you can do message passing like MPI, but directly between GPUs. It's interesting. You can have new programming languages specifically designed to deal with parallel environments or GPUs, and so on and so forth. So the key message here is that in order to have an efficient code, so for those of you who are interested in that, of course, we are evolving towards a situation which is not very good, I think. We have more and more cores to deal with inside the nodes, and they are getting slower and slower. The memory per core is constant or even decreasing, unless you're lucky, like Rommel, to have a gigantic machine. But most of the computers you have are less and less memory per core. The level of parallelism becomes crazy. You have to deal with millions of cores. And one issue is the input-output. It's very hard to write data on disk, and that's one of the main bottlenecks those days. So anyway, so that's a complicated era, I think, because it's really messy. You have to know a lot of different aspects. It has to be multidisciplinary, so it's quite complex. So here, actually, I downloaded this list this morning. So this list was published this month in this website, if you want. So that's the list of the 500 largest supercomputers in the world. And actually, that's the new entry here, the Summit machine, which is a GPU cluster with NVIDIA GPUs. And then the former number one, which is now number two, is a machine in China, which is actually not a GPU machine. It's a multi-core machine, right? And then you go down the list. So that's another NVIDIA machine here, which made it in the list too. Another Chinese multi-core machine, and then another NVIDIA machine in Switzerland, and the old Titan supercomputer, which is also an NVIDIA machine, right? So you see on the top 6, you have 4 GPU, oh, 5 actually. This one too. You have 5 GPU accelerated machines, right? So seriously, it's a trend which is now really, that's it, right? We are now at the era where GPU are doing all the efficient computing those days. Okay, so now if we go back to N-body codes, there is this plot, which is very famous in our field, which has been made by Volker Springel, and I have hacked it a bit. So again, that's the year here, and that's the number of particles in your N-body simulation you can do. And so you see it's an exponential rise. which is actually faster than the computing power evolution I showed you before. Right? So we are not actually sitting on our hands doing nothing. We are developing new techniques, and that's the meaning of the color here. The color is the computational techniques used to solve the Poisson's equation. So orange is direct n-body, n square, and then you have particle mesh, or the variance in green, and then you have the tree code in light blue, then you have the adaptive mesh codes, and then you have the fast multiple code with GPU acceleration. Right? And so you see that now, typically, so this recent work here in 2015, I think, or 16, no, 17, well, 16 is written, 2016, reaches 2 trillion particles. So that's what we can do now, 2 trillion particles, so 2 times 10 to the 12 particle in an n-body solver, right? Using the fast multiple method and a GPU. So we are really at the maximum of what we can do here, right? And this will be evolving in the next years. I know Volker is preparing a run with 4 trillion particles, for example. So this is going to slowly increase. Now the question is, are we reaching a plateau in computing power? Some people think we are, because we are kind of reaching all the maximum thing, but you know, we are not there yet, so let's be optimistic. Okay, so that's it for the n-body and HPC. So let's move to hydrodynamics. I still have 38 minutes, great. Okay, so I will focus on the numerical techniques now to solve the Euler equations, which is the basics of basic equation to describe the evolution of a compressible fluid. And I will really focus on one aspect, which is the take-home message for you, is the numerical errors, or the so-called numerical diffusion, right? And it's very important to know your enemy if you want to beat it. And here, I think it's very important to know and to have a good estimate of the numerical errors in order to make sure that you understand your results. And I've shown you an example for the n-body codes of the error in the force, which you know, is not 0. And here you have the same kind of error analysis you can perform. And I will try to give you a sense of how you can derive how you can perform such an error analysis, which you know, we will connect with tomorrow. So Euler equation, what is that? So basically the Euler equation, it's the limit. So you take the Boltzmann equation again, like before, except now you have a collision term, and the collisions are so strong and so efficient that your distribution function f is converging towards the Maxwell distribution function. Right? So that's the other absolute limit of the collisional Boltzmann equation. So dark matter, it's the collisional Boltzmann equation where there is C equals 0. And the Euler equation is the collisional Boltzmann equation where C, the collision term, is infinite, if you want. Right? And so what it means, because it's so large, because the collision rate is so high, is f, your distribution function, is driven towards f naught, the Maxwell equilibrium distribution function, and then everything is fixed. And then you can derive your, we take the moments of the Boltzmann equation, and you find those 3 equations, which are conservation laws, which is the conservation of mass, of momentum, and of total energy. Right? And these conservation laws are valid only in the limit where the collisions are strong enough to drive you there. Right? And it's a key point that a lot of people are overlooking, is where or when are the Euler equations valid, right? Because we're all using our codes at black box, but we never question the validity of these equations. Actually, it's valid only when the collision rate is high enough. And so if you compute your collision rate, for example, in galaxy cluster, where the temperature is very high, the density is very low, galaxy clusters, you can really seriously question the validity of Euler equation. So, and then you need to add some stuff, you need to do something, right? This is wrong, you cannot use it anymore, right? So if you are in a cold, dense environment, like the ISM, for example, probably the Euler equations are a very good approximation. Right? But they're only approximations. They're only the limit, the idealized limit of an infinite collision rate. Okay, of course, you need to introduce some additional stuff in cosmology or galaxy formation. You need to add the gravity, you need to add cooling and heating processes, and you need to add mass sink terms due to star formation, for example. Okay, so key point here, we are dealing with conservation laws, right? Mass, momentum, and energy. And of course, yeah, I forgot to say here that you need the pressure, and the pressure is given by the equation of state, which, again, for a Maxwell gas, is fixed by a gamma equal 5/3. Okay, so actually there are three interesting limits here. So here I've written the Euler equation again as conservation laws, but in 1D, in one dimension. So there is only one coordinate here, x. And I have also written them in a vector form, which is quite handy. So capital U is the vector of the conserved variable, the conservative variable, as we say. And capital F is the vector of the flux function. Right. And so the Euler equation can be written as the time derivative of the conservative variable plus the divergence of a flux function. Okay, very simple. Except this flux function can take, so that's for the Euler equation. Sorry, that's the Euler equation. But you can simplify, for example, in the ISM, in the dense ISM, the temperature, as it was discussed here yesterday, the temperature is very cold. It's almost fixed at 10 degree Kelvin, right, because of the cooling and heating processes. So if it's fixed at 10 degree Kelvin, then it means the pressure is given by an isothermal equation of state. And you don't need to integrate the energy equation. You don't need the energy anymore because the pressure is fixed to be rho times the sound speed square. So then it means you can simplify your problem from a 3-variable problem to a 2-variable problem, which is simpler, right? Of course, at the other end of the spectrum, you have the ideal MHD equation. So I'm not going to justify where they come from, but the ideal MHD equation, so you have to introduce the 3 component of the magnetic field. So you have the 5 variables, so 3 component of the momentum, total energy, and the 3 component of the magnetic field. And then the ideal MHD equation, again, can be written using the same conservation form, except the flux function is now more complicated, right? So my point here is to say that you have here 3 different systems of equations, from very simple to very complicated. They all can be written like that, right? And so everything I'm going to say applies to any of those 3 systems, right? Almost like a black box, in a sense, right? Okay, so let's focus a little bit on the isothermal Euler equation, which is very simple. So that's the conservation of mass, momentum, that's the isothermal sound speed here, so that's the pressure here. And there is another form, which is also used a lot in all those codes, which is the so-called primitive form, where now you use the density and the velocity, so you don't use the momentum anymore, you use the velocity, and you develop those partial differential terms here into a so-called quasi-linear form. Right? So it's quasi-linear because you see that you have only derivative of the primitive variable. Right? And so this form is interesting because now you can actually linearize those equations. You can say, okay, I'm going to put myself close to a reference state where u and rho are fixed, are constant, and then I have a linear form of the equation. Okay? So one interesting point here, you can, for example, assume that your sound speed is very small. For example, 10 Kelvin, your sound speed is like 0.2 km per second. It's nothing, right? If your galaxy rotates at 10 km per second, at 200 km per second, right? And the velocity dispersion of the gas is 10 km per second, the sound speed is 0, right? I mean, you can ignore it. Right? So then this term goes away, and then you're left with what is called the Burger's equation, right? Which is what Yves described yesterday as Burger's turbulence. So that's the ISM turbulence. It's described if you put this to 0, then you have one equation on the velocity. That's it. That's Burger's equation. You're done, right? Then there is another limit which is interesting, is when the velocity is uniform. The velocity is fixed to a constant. So you don't need this guy, and this guy goes away. And then you're left with a very simple equation, which is called the advection equation. Right? So basically, you advect your density at a fixed velocity u. Okay? So those are the all the equations you can find and use to try to understand what's going on. Right? So Burger's equation, if you put the sound speed to 0, and advection equation, if you put the velocity to a constant. Okay? Okay, now let's try to play with the advection equation, right? The simplest of all. So, okay, so that's my advection equation here on the lower left corner. So U is now my density, and A is my constant velocity. Okay? So that's my advection equation. I want to solve numerically the problem. How do I do that? So, okay, let's try to do it without thinking too much. So, okay, I'm going to discretize my time with time steps. So times Tn here, Tn plus 1. And I will discretize space using points. I put points in space, equidistant points. And that's where my solution will be defined. Okay, so my numerical solution at times Tn and at position xi is given by this. Right? So it's an array in your computer program. So now, how do I discretize my space derivative? So if I want to compute the space derivative here, so here clearly there is not a lot of options, so I can approximate by a finite difference approximation by taking those two guys and divide by the distance, and I get an approximate of my spatial derivative. Right? So now, how do I approximate my time derivative? And again, there is many possible choices, right? I'm not saying that's a unique choice, it's just one natural choice. My time derivative, well, I take my solution here that I don't know, and I subtract by the solution here that I know, divide by a time step, and I have an estimate, a finite difference approximation of the time derivative. Okay, great. So now let's put all this, so these two finite difference approximations, let's put them here in this equation. And then I got my numerical equation, which is good, because I know my solution at times n, so I know those three numbers, so I can deduce the solution at times n plus 1. Oh my God, it works. Right. So now I can put this in the computer, and it will fail miserably. Right? And like really violently. Right? And so it's a bit unfair because it's really the simplest thing, right? But it doesn't work. So why doesn't it work? So here is a little bit of math. You can do it yourself. It's very easy, nothing complicated. But what I like is that it's all analytical. Right? So you can really understand what's going on. So the key point here, the key word, is the so-called modified equation. Right? So the modified equation is a new equation. It's not the equation you started with. It's not the advection equation you started with. It's the new equation, which is the equation you're solving numerically. Right? So how does it work? So basically, you start with your discretized scheme here, and then you perform a Taylor expansion. So you Taylor expand in time for the guy here, un plus 1, and you Taylor expand in space for the left and the right cell that enter the spatial derivative here, right? So you do a Taylor expansion up to second order, right? You keep the second order terms and you drop the other ones. And then you inject everything in the discretized equation, and then what do you find? You find this, plus higher order terms. Okay? And now this time derivative, you will replace it by the spatial derivative using the equation you're trying to solve, right? So, and then you end up with this equation, plus higher order terms. And so you see that to leading order, and that's the key point here, to leading order, you're not solving this equals 0. No. You're solving this equal this guy. And this guy is the truncation error. It's the leading error term. And actually here, you see with Aurore, it's dramatic, that it's a diffusion operator, right? Hence, it's really the Laplacian of U. It's really the second order derivative of U, so it's really a diffusion operator, good old diffusion operator, except the coefficient is negative. So negative diffusion coefficient, nature forbid that, right? It's against nature, and actually that's why it's unstable, because a negative diffusion gives you unstable results. Right? It amplifies the noise, right? This explains why your scheme, the previous scheme, was completely unstable, and this is actually the modified equation. So this guy here is the modified equation. So it's a new equation which describes your scheme mathematically. So it's a continuous equation. Okay. So now let's move to another solution. And again, I will not justify. So we are back to square one, right? Because this is a failure. So let's try something else. So I will actually try something which seems a bit silly at first, which is a so-called upwind scheme, where you say, okay, for the spatial derivative, I'm not going to use the natural central symmetric finite difference approximation. I will use an asymmetric one. Why? No idea. I'm going to try that, right? And so I say, okay, my spatial derivative is not going to be x ui plus 1 minus ui minus 1, but it's going to be this one in the middle minus the one on the left, right? And why is it on the left? It's upwind, because the velocity a is positive, it's going to the right. And so I'm choosing the element on the left, upwind, right? So if I do that, then I can inject this, that's my new scheme. Right? So it's not I plus 1 and 2 delta x, now it's I and delta x. And then I do the same second order Taylor expansion. I get different terms. I use the same trick. I replace this guy by the spatial derivative. And now I find this. And that's my new modified equation. Right? You see that the error now, so it's still a diffusion term. But now the coefficient is positive only if this parameter c is less than 1. So if I am careful enough to choose my parameter c, which is related to the time step, the size of the time step, then I will make sure that the diffusion coefficient is positive. And then I will have a stable problem. And indeed, this scheme works. If you choose the courant factor, so that's called the courant factor, it's the speed times the time step divided by delta x. If you choose the courant factor less than 1, so if you choose the time step small enough, it will be stable. Right? And you have the shape of the error. That's the error you're making. Right? That's the leading order term. So very briefly, that's the generic result in all the different schemes. You can write actually the leading error term like that, and eta is the numerical diffusion parameter. That's why we call numerical diffusion, right? Because there is this eta term, and in the case of the upwind scheme, that's the shape of eta. Right? And so what does it do? If you have a discontinuity, for example, if you start with a discontinuous density profile, the correct solution is to advect the discontinuity. Right? So the correct solution, you just move the discontinuity to the right. And nothing, it's a boring thing, it moves to the right and doesn't change. The numerical solution, though, is not like that. Right? It diffuses the discontinuity. The discontinuity now becomes thick and continuous, and the thickness increases with time as the square root of eta t, which is the so-called solution of the heat equation, right? So it's an analytical solution. And you see that the numerical diffusion will actually smooth out things with time, like a diffusion process. Okay. So now let's try to do something slightly more, I would say, logical. So it's the so-called finite volume scheme, right? So now we change a little bit the philosophy of our discretization. We don't use points anymore, right? So we use volumes. So now your mesh has bond interfaces, little boundaries, which define volumes. And the volume is inside, is the entire volume in between those two boundaries, right? So there is no point anymore, right? You can define a point if you want as the center of the volume, but the point itself has no value. The only valuable numerical quantity is the volume, right? And everything that's inside the volume, right? So that's the finite volume approach. The previous approach was the finite difference approach. Okay, so now your numerical quantity is not the density evaluated at a point. No, it's the average within the volume, right? But in the end, you're left with a numerical number, right? So in the end, you have the same, right? But the philosophy is different. So now if you write down your advection equation here, and then you integrate both in space and time, so it's something exact. I mean, there is nothing wrong here, no approximation. Then you obtain this so-called finite volume approximation of your advection equation, which is exact, right? So that's the key point with what we did before. Here, it's an exact derivation of your discretized version of the advection equation. And the key point here is that you have those new guys, which are the time-averaged fluxes, right, across those interfaces. And of course, it's hard to compute those time average fluxes, right? How do you do that, right? So that's the Godunov technique, the Godunov idea. So it's a mathematician, a Russian mathematician. We said, oh, but wait, in this case, it's easy because I know the solution. An advection problem is very easy, right? Advection, what do? You have your initial profile and it moves to the right, right? So I know the solution. And so the key idea here is to assume that initially, at times n, you have a piecewise constant solution. That's your approximation. It's piecewise constant. And then you know that the solution of this, of the time evolution of this is to move this piecewise constant state to the direction of the velocity field. Right? And the analytical solution is just this guy. So that's the value here, is the value of the density on the left, right? Because it moves with the flow. And then it justifies the so-called upwind scheme from very clear and logical grounds. Okay? And so the Godunov scheme, following this methodology, which is a finite volume approach, is strictly equivalent, is identical actually, to the upwind finite difference scheme, except it's a much better justified theory. Okay? So that's basically the idea of all the hydro codes now you can use everywhere. They're all based on this technique. Okay? All of them. So let's take a slightly more complicated example here, just to show you how it works in a slightly more involving case. So I'm using the isothermal Euler equation, and I'm going to linearize them. So I'm going to assume that I am in the wave limit, in the small perturbation limit. Right? So that's easy. So what you do is you basically write your primitive variable, which is here density and velocity, as a reference density and velocity plus a small perturbation. And you assume delta W, the perturbation is small. So if you do that, then going back to the primitive form at a couple of slides before, you obtain actually a new system of equation where the unknown is not the density and the velocity, but it's a perturbation in the density and the velocity. So the delta rho and delta U. Okay? Plus a matrix A, which is a constant matrix, which is actually the reference state, which is here. So the reference velocity, maybe I should have put 0 here to be more clear, but anyway. So that's the reference state, which is a constant. And then your equation now looks like that. So what you do now, that's really at the heart of all these numerical techniques. You have this matrix, you're going to diagonalize it. You're going to find the eigenvectors and the eigenvalues. So the eigenvalues are here, right? And that's the sound waves. Those are the so-called sound waves, right? Sound wave moving to the right and sound wave moving to the left. And those are eigenvectors, right? Okay, they are a combination of density and velocity perturbation. Okay? So now if you use this eigenvector decomposition, you can express this equation into two independent equations because you are in the eigenvector basis. Right? And so now those two independent equations, how do they look like? They look like advection equations. They are advection equations, except the velocity is not u. The velocity is the sound velocity to the right for the plus wave, and the sound velocity to the left for the minus wave. Right? But there are two advection equations. So you know how to deal with this, right? You just move to the right or to the left, depending on the sign of this guy. Right? Okay? So it's a very easy problem to solve. So now we can go back to this piecewise constant representation that Godunov was using, right? And solve what is called the Riemann problem. So what is a Riemann problem? It's a piecewise constant state with a left constant state and a right constant state. So that's your initial condition. So you have a left state, constant, for the perturbation, and a right state. And then what happens is that you have this left propagating wave, left propagating sound wave, and this right propagating sound wave, which emanates from each point. Right? And actually, the problem here is a pure advection problem. Right? So the value that you have here is advected, so it's constant, it's conserved along this trajectory, right? So that's the time, and that's the space. And so now what you see here is that if now you look at what's happening close to the interface, well, you have a mixture of blue and red lines, meaning you have a mixture of left going right state and right going left state. Okay, so you have a lot of left and right here. But basically, what happens is that if now you want to compute the density perturbation here, you have to combine the blue quantity that is conserved coming from the right and the red quantity that is conserved coming from the left. Okay, and so now you can compute the density perturbation as the sum of the two eigen states, one that comes from the left state, but propagating with the plus sign, and one that comes from the right state, propagating with the minus sign. And that's how you compute the new perturbation here in this so-called mixed state. Okay? And that's the state you will use to compute your flux in the Godunov method. Right? So you see here it's slightly more complicated than the advection equation because you're advecting two different eigenstates, and you have to combine them. Right? But in the end, it's the same idea. Right? So this mixed state is the solution to your Riemann problem at the interface. And that's the mixed state you're going to use to compute the flux. Okay? So let's do it. So now I'm writing the Godunov scheme. So this is the Godunov scheme for the isothermal wave equation. The flux here, that's the flux we don't know. And how do you compute the flux? Well, you're going to use the mixed state. Right? So U and rho are constant in this case. They are the reference state. And the delta rho and delta U here are the deltas in the mixed state in between the two. Right? And you can compute the mixed state, so let's do that. So you inject the value here and here, and you end up with the density in the mixed state and the velocity in the mixed state as the average of the left and right density, which seems to be a natural choice, by the way, plus a term here, a correction term that comes from the two states propagating left and right. And you see that this term can be written as a gradient of the left and right state. And that's the key point. And so now if you combine all this into the final flux, you see that you have something which is actually an average of the left and right cell, which is actually a centered scheme, exactly like your centered finite difference scheme that we used before. We know it's going to be unstable. Plus a correction term, which is called the diffusive term, which looks like a diffusion coefficient times the gradient of the quantity. Okay? And you see that this comes from one fact, which is you're upwinding the eigenstate of your equation, system of equation. Right? So it's the upwind term. This is the upwind term, right? Which is also the diffusive term. So even in this case, which is slightly more involving than the Heisenberg equation, you can really write formally the numerical flux as a true flux, a high order flux, a flux which is just obtained by just averaging the quantity without, ignoring the propagation of the waves. And a correction term that you can put on the right-hand side in your modified equation, which comes from the upwinding of the wave, and which is a stabilizing term. Okay, so this term will stabilize your system. And this term will also represent the leading order error in your modified equation. Okay, so it's always of the order of the wave speed, in this case, the sound speed, times the mesh size. And you see immediately that the smaller the mesh size, so the larger the grid, the smaller the diffusion, and so the smaller the error, right, which makes sense. Okay, so this I just did here in the simple case of the isothermal wave equation. It's called the Riemann solver. Okay, it's basically how you solve the Riemann problem, and this is already quite complicated, right? But in the complete case, it's more complicated, right? So that's actually the Riemann problem here for the Euler equation. So now I'm not talking about the isothermal wave equation. I'm talking about the full-blown Euler equation, right? And here, so you have the velocity, the pressure, the density, and the entropy of your Riemann problem. So initially, the initial condition is just piecewise constant state, which meet at x equal 0.5, right? And the piecewise value, the initial values are the one on the extreme left and right, right? And then everything in between is the solution of the Riemann problem. Okay? So you see that now it's nonlinear because you have a shock here. you have a rarefaction wave which follow this shape here. Right? And you have also a contact discontinuity here, where the entropy is jumping. Okay, so you see it's more complicated. So now if you look what happens in space-time, so that's the density. Yes, that's the density, so that's position and that's time. Right? So it's the same kind of representation that one I did before. And you see now it's a profile, it's very complicated. Right? I mean, so you have a shock, here the shock propagates, you have the contact discontinuity, then it's flat, and then you have the rarefaction wave, and then it's flat again. Right? And so now your Godunov solution, your Godunov flux, it's you're going to use the value here at the middle. So that's going to be your flux. And the flux, the Godunov flux, will be evaluated at this position here. Okay, and that's how you get it. So you have to solve for all this messy thing in order to get the right flux. Okay, so this is the so-called exact solution to the Riemann problem. Okay, so now let's summarize. So that's actually the summary. For any right, it's very, very powerful. Any system of conservation laws which contain waves, it has to contain waves, right? If it doesn't contain waves, then it's wrong. So if it contains waves, then you say the system is hyperbolic system of conservation laws. So that's really the mathematical definition. If you have a hyperbolic system of conservation laws, then you can apply this methodology like a black box, right? So it's a finite volume approximation. So you assume it's piecewise constant, poof, poof, poof. Then you can write an exact form of the conservation law. And then you need to compute this flux. So in order to compute the flux, you solve the Riemann problem at each interface. So at each interface, you have a complex Riemann problem like that, right? We did the simplified isothermal wave case, but okay, it's more complicated in general. And this Riemann problem then will give you the flux at the interface that you inject here. And once you know the flux, then you can solve for the new solution n+1. Okay, so I have 5 more minutes here, a bit more, but I will finish by describing a few popular Riemann solvers. So clearly, the brute force approach, which is the one I'm describing here, which is to solve the exact Riemann problem, is possible. Right. Clearly, it's possible. Exact Riemann solvers are expensive because you have to find the root of complex nonlinear functions, but it's nothing that you cannot do, especially now that you can use GPUs to do this fast. I would say it's not really a problem. But sometimes it's better to have a flux function that you understand better because it's a simpler form, right? And so that's what we call approximate Riemann solvers, right? And most of the codes that you will use or you are using are based on approximations of the Riemann solution, right? And for example, there is one very popular approximate Riemann solver, which is the so-called HLL Riemann solver. And HLL stands for the names of the guy, Arten, Lax, and Lee, but it's not written here, but anyway. So the idea is to say that you force your system of conservation law, even if it's very complicated, like Euler equation, even worse, the ideal MHD equation, where you have 7 waves, so it's a nightmare. You say, I don't care, I want to have 2 waves only, just 2 waves. One on the right and one on the left. Even if I have, in fact, way more waves than that in reality, I just say, no, I want 2 waves. So then you can actually, again, you can solve for the mixed state in between, right? Exactly what we did for the isothermal wave equation. And you can find the central state by solving a conservation law in this volume element here in phase space. And then you find the central state, it's given by that. And you see that it's very general, right? It depends only on those formal U and F vectors, but you can apply this to anything, to the ideal MHD equation, to anything, right? That's why this approach is so powerful. And then you just compute the Godunov flux by basically solving for the conservation law in this domain. In the end, you get this form here, right? So, and everything is explicit, right? So you have a closed analytical form for your flux function, which does not require any complex time integration. Of course, it's an approximation, right? Obviously, because we know that inside this star state here, which is assumed to be flat and constant here, you have a wave with a lot of structure inside that you completely ignore. The key point here is that this will give you something which will be more diffusive. You will have more numerical diffusion than if you would have used the exact solver, right? But the extra numerical diffusion you get is, it's something you can live with if you're ready to pay this additional error, right? But the scheme will still be stable. That's the key point. You're going to have a stable scheme if you use this approach with more numerical diffusion. If you want to minimize the numerical diffusion, then you have to be more and more exact. You have to go towards the exact solution, right? The exact solution being the least numerical diffusion you can get. That's the minimum diffusive solution. So, okay, I'm almost done. So there are other very popular Riemann solvers. So that's the Lax-Friedrich Riemann solver, where you compute the wave speed in a way which makes the whole problem even simpler. And that's your numerical flux. So the Lax-Friedrich Riemann solver is beautiful because you have a closed form for the flux. So that's the flux. Poof. Right. So, of course, it's the most diffusive one. It's really the one that diffuses everything, but it's very, very robust, very diffusive also. And then you have something which is actually the most popular one because it's the closest to the exact Riemann solver, although it's still very approximate and very simple. It's the so-called HLC Riemann solver, where you basically assume that instead of having one single mid state, you have two, one on the left and one on the right, which is separated by the contact discontinuity. So now you're almost exactly like the exact solvers, right? Except that you still assume that they are constant. You don't have any structure inside. Okay, before I stop here, I have 3 minutes. I want to mention briefly an issue that, again, you can derive analytically using this simple exercise. See, what happens if you have a non-uniform mesh, right? Because all this nice Taylor expansion thing, modified equation, everything I did was for a uniform mesh. But what happens if your mesh is not uniform? So when does this happen? I see two cases here in the room. One is adaptive mesh refinement, where the mesh is changing abruptly by a factor of 2 across the level boundaries. I see another example, which is moving mesh codes, where the mesh is non-uniform, although not as abruptly as a factor of 2, but kind of everywhere. So the question is, what happens if you have a non-uniform mesh, right? It's kind of relevant. Okay, so let's do the same Taylor expansion game. So I'm using my favorite Godunov scheme, except that now I assume that the left cells are separated by a distance alpha delta x. Alpha being larger than 1 or smaller than 1, depending on what's happening there. So you can do the same exercise. So you can Taylor expand your numerical scheme, and then you inject in your finite volume approximation, and you get the leading order term here. But look what happens here. There is an alpha here on the left. Ugly, right? It means that now you're modifying your wave speed. So you're not solving the addition equation anymore. So now your leading order term is here. It's not on the right-hand side. There is an error term here on the right-hand side, but there is now the leading order term is first order. So you lost 1 order of accuracy. And so if alpha is 2 or half, oof, right? If alpha is 1.1 or 1.2, okay. But if it's, anyway, okay. So you can go to high order, actually. So I haven't discussed the high order schemes, I didn't have time, but you can go to high order, and then you restore the correct wave speed, but then your numerical diffusion can be negative, right? If alpha is greater than 1, then you have an unstable scheme, right? That's pretty bad, right? So that's one of example of, you have to be very careful with what you're doing. And if your mesh is not uniform, you may have some issues, right? And so let me briefly, before I stop, show you one problem, a very famous one. So that's a shock which propagates from the left to the right. So that's the solution on a coarse uniform mesh. Now, if the shock propagates from fine to coarse, it's fine, right? But if the shock propagates from coarse to fine, then you have a blip. You have a small blip. And this was introduced by the fact that you are in an unstable situation that was transient. It's a transient unstable situation. Right? Just it happens when the shock crossed this thing here. And then it imprinted a blip that you will carry around in the rest of the time of the simulation. Right? Now, if you have a non-uniform mesh all the way, right, maybe the blip will be smaller, right, but it might grow in time, and so careful. So, of course, one way is to go to even higher order. So if you go to even higher order, then all these things are going to be smaller and smaller and probably will not matter too much. Okay, I think I'm done, so I'm going to stop here.
Thanks very much, Romain. We could take a couple quick questions for the break.
So when you were talking about your kind of adaptive gravity scheme, you showed that in your errors, it looked like there was kind of a wave in the errors.
Mm-hmm.
Does that introduce, introducing that kind of length scale in the errors, does that cause problems? Does that correlate the errors? Or
Of course it does. So there is something very important here is that you always have an error. Always. And the key question is your error going to dominate your solution? And so, for example, if you start with let's take a relevant example. You have a halo in hydrostatic equilibrium. So the velocity is 0 everywhere. And you want it to stay 0 everywhere. And now, because you have this adaptive kind of grids, you introduce a blip in the force at a few percent level. Right? But a small discontinuity in the force, this will imprint something immediately on your zero velocity field, because even if you make your error one order of magnitude smaller, you're going to still see a small induced spurious velocity field. So now, if this spurious velocity field is much smaller than, for example, the turbulence you have in your halo, the natural turbulence, then you don't care. But if your error is larger than the turbulence you expect, realistically, then you're in trouble. And then you really need to work on bringing this error down, smaller than the error. So this is basically the key point here. And so some problems, for example, require such a high accuracy that they require a new methodology. And those are usually called well-balanced schemes, where you really want the numerical error, to be maintained to a level which is lower than the very small amplitude waves you're interested in. And they require new methodologies. But the key point is that you need to know your error, to understand it, and to make sure that it's not dominating your solution.
Okay, others?
Coffee break?
Okay, let's have the coffee break then, and